Hello and welcome to RPGDU's Class 1 for Camp Codo, the Introduction to HTML and CSS. This was broadcast live a number of times, and this class and video recording is for those who couldn't make it or who didn't know about it in time. I'm going to try and cover everything that was covered in the classes so that no one will be left behind. If you have any questions or you're not sure of something, please go to the forums on RPGD and ask your questions there. This first class is very basic and straightforward. It should give you the footing that you need to get into the course, and we will build on this course for the rest of Camp Codo. So, without further ado, what is HTML? Because when we talk about it, you may have different things in your head to somebody else. HTML is the language that is used to create almost every web page you visit and provides a logical structure for the web page's content. It is basically the language that every browser can interpret. And it is also the language that your document object model then executes. What you do is create markup, which is what it's actually called, and then you use that markup to tell the browser what to give you as a visual representation. You are giving it a skeleton, and it is going to create something for you from that skeleton. Now, how do you prepare your blank documents for HTML? In general, every single web page is written in HTML. There are a few exceptions, but for our purposes, you are going to be using HTML. This is the language that has been used basically since the internet began. And although it hasn't changed terribly much, it has gone through a few revisions. As technology has advanced and people's desires for what they want out of the internet has advanced, they have done revisions of what HTML can do and its capabilities. Currently, we are on HTML5. And by the end of this course, that is what you will be using. That said, HTML5 is, relatively speaking, in the grand scheme of things, quite new. And in terms of role plays and coding for role plays, there are skins that still operate on HTML4 and sometimes even on HTML3, depending on how old the skins are. It's rare, but it happens. So, how do you make sure that your skins are up into the latest standards? You have to put down this doc type declaration at the top of all of your documents. If you've ever played with the wrapper of any of the free hosts, you will have seen this before. You just put that right at the top of your document, and that will tell the browser which standard you would like that browser to use. After that, you need to structure your HTML document. Once again, if you have ever looked into the back of a skin or a free host, this structure should look very familiar. It is the structure that every single web page is based on. You have a head element and a body element, and they can never be duplicated. Only one of each in any page. This is how skins work, how WordPress works, how every single web page you've ever visited probably works. Now, this is called the boilerplate. And it is very important for you to understand how it works, because later on in week 3, when we cover skinning, this will come into play quite intensely, and understanding how it works now will make that much easier to understand. Now, before we get into the deep, meaningful conversations of things, I would like to clear up a little bit of vocab. A lot of people use incorrect names for their codes because most of us learned on the fly. So just to clear up so that we're all talking about the same things, anything that is between angled brackets is called a tag. So that is a body tag, that is a body tag, that is a head tag, etc. Most elements will have an opening tag and a closing tag. And anything that is between an opening and closing tag is called an element. So this is an opening head tag, a closing head tag, and it creates the head element, etc. Now, to create your boilerplate, after you've done your declaration, you have to enclose everything in the HTML element so that the web page understands that is what you would like it to execute. Fairly simple. After that, you create your head tags. Head tags are the head tags create the head element, which is everything that sits quote unquote above your web page. It is necessary for the web page to execute, but it is not necessarily visible directly. This includes things like titles, externally hosted CSS, your jQueries, your other scripts, etc. After that, you have body tags. Now, the body tags create the body element, and that is everything that is actually visible within the window. All of your body elements are within the window, and you should only ever have one because you're only ever looking at one page at a time. Fairly simple to understand. Then you have what are called title tags. The title element is what names your web page, as in physically names the tab or window. For most free hosts, this is a feature that you edit elsewhere in the admin panel and is inserted. For 98% of people, that's perfectly fine. Just know that you can, in fact, edit this title if you would like to and make it something a little bit more unique. Moving along to common HTML elements. Because there are quite a few things that people would like to do that are quite standard, HTML creators have come up with some standard elements that come with their own minor pre-styling. This is a few examples. There are more, but these are the ones you will probably come across most often. First one is headings. If you type in H1 and put something between it and then H1, that will come out as something large, bolded, with some paddings and some margins. Heading H2 will create a subheading, H3 will create a smaller subheading, and so forth. You can change the way these look using your style sheet in a cascading style sheet. And this is very, very handy if you would like all of the headings on your website to look the same way. One thing you should do, it's also very handy for your templates, etc., because it is very easy for people to understand how to insert these. They work a lot like a BB code. There are 7 tiers of headings, and if you're going to use these for your templates, please respect the order that they are in. Do not attempt to make heading 2 your main heading and then decide later on heading 1 is a subheading. The document object model is going to execute them in order because that is how it is programmed. So if you're going to use them, please respect their order. The next most common one you'll probably see are paragraph tags. They do exactly what they say on the tin. They give you new paragraphs. We will cover this more closely in week 2, but paragraphs are a block level element, which means the moment that you put in a new one, it will create another block beneath it and another block beneath it, etc. If you do not wish to do this, then you want something like span tags, which are an inline element, meaning that if you create something and wrap, say, this section of text in span tags, it will not force a new line. It will continue the line as you wish to continue it. Span tags, aside from being useful for being an inline element, are useful for targeting very specific pieces of your markup. So if you want to target a specific element or just a specific line of text and change just that, span tags are what you need to use. The next most common element used is a list, and they come in 2 types, an ordered list and an unordered list. Ordered lists very obviously are 1 to 5, A to Z, etc., etc., and an unordered list is a list with dots. These forever were just used for exactly what they say, but recently this has become a very powerful tool for creating new and interesting things, such as tabs, which will be covered in week 5. You can create tabbed elements with these just using HTML and CSS, where previously you would have to use some kind of JavaScript. So make sure you understand exactly how lists work, because they can be very, very useful in your markups to create powerful things without very much coding. The next common elements that we're going to cover are actually called anchor elements. Most people refer to these just as links. And the reason they are a link is because the anchor element is anchoring a reference to another page. That's why it's got its name. You should all have come across these at least once or twice in coding. They're very simple to understand and very straightforward to use. You can, however, modify them using attributes. This provides more information about the content, and it is not unique to the anchor. There are a couple dozen different attributes that you could conceivably apply to an anchor element. We're not going to cover them all. Just to give you a particular example, the most common one probably used is target. And the target attribute, if you put in target blank, forces the link to open up on a new page or in a new tab. This is very handy and is probably the most common thing you will see, but there is also an option for target self, just as another example, which means that it is not to open a new page, it is to jump down to the link, wherever your link comes from. This is handy for things like lore pages. If you have multiple posts in a thread for your lore, it will just jump it down as opposed to opening it on a new page. Next common element is the image element, and it is one of the few elements that have no closing tags. You do not have to put /image at the end of the tag. Just put the slash just before the last angle bracket, and that's all you need. The way this works is it is displaying the image of a source URL. That's basically all how it works. Same as the anchor tags, it has attributes that can be used to modify it, and the most common one that you should probably be using is the alternate attribute. You should use this on every image in your sites and on your web pages and in your skins where the information about the image is important. For people who are visually impaired or those who turn their images off for fear of triggering light-sensitive disorders, this alt attribute can be read by screen readers. So what happens is you put in your image and then you give it an alternate description, and then if the image doesn't show up, the text will. This is very useful for people who cannot see properly or at all, or people who turn their images off for whatever reason. But don't use it on every image on your forum. If an image is just for decoration, then leave the alternate tag out. It's unnecessary in that case. It should be used for things like banner images or setting images, but not for decorative ones. Another important thing to know about your HTML, and a very important thing to respect, is spacing. One thing that was taught by Black's custom forum structure is the habit of compressing all of your code into a single line in order for it to be readable by that script. This is not necessary by anything else, and it actually makes your code very difficult to read and to edit for both yourself and anyone else who is using it. The World Wide Web Consortium, which is responsible for maintaining the style standards of HTML, recommend 2 spaces of indentation. 2 spaces of indentation looks like this, with a 2 space and then a 2 space, etc. It just makes it easier for you to read and edit. 2 spaces are not mandatory. You can, in fact, have your spaces 3 spaces or use a tab, whatever makes you happy. Just please space out your codes. Another practice which everyone should get into the habit of is commenting their codes. If you want to comment, let somebody know who is using your codes, they should comment them so that you should comment them so that they understand what it is you wanted somebody to do there. This is not a common practice amongst hobby coders, but it is very helpful, even if the only other person who will ever be seeing your code is something like your co-admin helping you to maintain your site. Not everyone follows the same logic stream, so giving instructions in code comments is very handy. How this works is anything between this special arrangement of tags will not be executed by the document object model. It will just skip it. So if you put this inside a web page, it's going to treat it as though it's not there, which is how comments work. This is also how wrapper keys are created by JSync and others, so they can input pieces of their database into your new custom sections. That will be covered more in depth in week 3. Now, a web page is all very well and good in HTML, but unfortunately it is not very useful in that it is just the structure of the information. Humans are visual creatures. We enjoy things that are pretty. So the only way to get pretty into your web pages is by using your cascading style sheets. This gives you the ability to edit the colors, the shapes, the sizes, the shadows, the positioning, etc. Now, there are 3 ways to get your cascading style sheets to see your HTML and vice versa. You can use the style element, you can use a link, or you can use what is known as inline styling. Each one has their own pros and cons, and each one should be used within its own realm. None of them are horrible or wonderful. They should just all be used properly. The style element, for example, allows you to put your styling inside your wrapper or inside where your HTML is. You put an open style tag, a close style tag, and put all of your CSS between it. This is very handy for things like posting templates, etc., where there's minimal styling, in fact, for the template. This, however, is not something you should use for an entire skin or something similar. That should be used. The next example of how you should do things is how you should link in a large amount of styling. If you just want to create a small template to allow your players or members to use, then the style element is probably the one for you. Also, if you'd like to create things to hand out. Everything's on one page. The pros of this is everything's on one page and it's quick to load, but the cons are, and the reason you shouldn't do it for large things, is that your document becomes almost impossible to maintain, and it is better practice to maintain the distinction between your HTML and its styling. The most common way, and probably the way everyone understands that their styling will be read by their page, is to use a link. When you have 2 documents that you have created, the easiest way to do this is to link them together. This is another element that does not require a closing tag, so please keep that in mind. Basically, you host your CSS in a file that is CSS. So it will hold all of your styling, and it will be a completely separate document. This is how all skins work, with the structure in one section and the styling in another, linked together. Most of this is to be separate. The cons: you have incorrect linkage, then all of your styling will disappear. So if you don't have the correct link, or you change the link, then the styling disappears for all of your markup. This is not necessarily. Link needs 3 elements for it to work. The first one is the reference for wherever the file is being hosted. The next is to, in case it is a text or CSS file, and then to tell the HTML markup what is the relationship it should have with this document, in which case the relationship is a style sheet. The final way to do this is called inline styling. Inline styling is similar to using the style element, except that you are putting it in line with the rest of your markup. This is very handy for making very small changes, but please do not do this on a large scale, not even on something like a posting template. It makes your markup very, very difficult to read and to edit, and there is no reason why you'd have to do this when the style element can float above and make things very neat and easy to see. This is handy if you want to change something like the specific alignment of a section, but don't do it for anything more elaborate than that. It's also mostly being phased out of HTML as HTML goes up in versions. So if you were to do this long ago, it would have been better, but now please use the styling element or a link in your styling. That is the more accepted way to do things. Now, knowing where your styling is great for your markup, but you have to be able to tell your markup exactly which styling it should read for each element. And the way to do that is with selectors. Now, just to get some vocab correct for CSS, everything that you use in CSS is known as a property, and it reads a value. So properties are things like size, color, font family, font size, alignment, etc. And values are whatever that property reads. So for color, it would read a color name. For size, it would read something in pixels or ems, etc. Now, you use a selector which selects the elements in the HTML. So if you were using paragraphs, that would be P, for example. Now, just to finish with the vocab, a selector has the proper syntax after it of open curly bracket, property, colon, value, semicolon, closed curly bracket. If you were to remove one of these semicolons accidentally, then the property would read everything up until the next semicolon as a value. So if you discover that you are busy with your coding or creating something and something is not reading properly, the first thing you should check is that your syntax is all properly in order. One thing that you should notice is that we talk about element CSS rules, and a rule is as follows. This is a selector, a property and a value together make a declaration, and the whole thing is called a rule. Generally speaking, you should try and make sure that your CSS has as few rules as possible. The less rules there are, the faster CSS will execute and the faster your site will load. In effort to make this easier, the creators of HTML and CSS have made it possible at some point for you to select multiple elements for the same styling. An example is here. I wanted all three of these boxes to have the same size, shape, and margining. So I created a single rule for all of that. Then the only different new rules it needed was to change the colors. You can do this for almost everything, and you can link an unlimited number of rules, of selectors up here to create a rule. So if you ended up with box 100 for some reason, you could go from 1 to 100 and it would have no problems doing that for you. This is also why you should keep your spacing in CSS very legible and clear, just like your HTML. And like HTML, it is recommended that you use 2 spaces, but it really is whatever makes you happy. You should just make sure that you have proper spacing and not to squish your code up all together like this. It is unnecessary and it doesn't actually impact load time enough for the pain of editing to be worth it. Another thing that you should probably do is learn to comment your CSS. Much like commenting your HTML, anything between these unique markers, this will not be read by the document object model and it will not be executed. So this as a code comment will never show up on a web page, for example. This is very handy for telling people which pieces of your styling apply to which bits of your markup. So you will know always what does what for where. If you are creating a large piece of coding like a web page or an entire skin, it is important to comment in your codes. Now, one of the most important things for people in their styling is colors. Color palettes are generally where designs begin. And while this is in no sense a design class, I will show you how you can make your designs come to life and make sure that they can be read by all of the browser windows viewing them. So colors are really important to people, and back in the bad old days of the internet, the screens did not have enough resolution and enough color intelligence to display very many colors. So after some trial and error, a list of 147 colors was created that were guaranteed to show up more or less in every browser. They became known as the named colors, and if you open this set of notes in a browser window, you can click a link and it will take you to a page which displays the name and all of the colors that you can use. It also allows you to filter them. Basically what this means is if you put in color brown, this is the tone that will show up, and it will be uniform every time. If you would like to know why, of all numbers, 147 colors specifically, you can actually go and look that up. It's quite an interesting read. However, that said, as screens became more intelligent and web pages became more elaborate, 147 colors, which was nothing in the grand scheme of how many colors there are, became too little for designers, and they wanted more. Then it's when people discovered and invented hexadecimal codes or hex codes. They are codes in base 16, hence the name, and they specify color mixtures of red, green, and blue. and they basically give you access to the entire color wheel. This was helpful, but is always in solid colors, and it does allow you to give mixtures and gradients, etc., which was fine for a time. As a side note, if you've used hex codes before, if your entire hex code is the same letter, then you can actually shorten it to 3 letters and it will still read, just as a side note. Anyway, what was handy about these hex codes was it allowed you to access to the entire color spectrum, but the problem was that it only allowed solid colors. So once again, people invented and created, and they came up with RGB colors, which stands for reds, greens, and blues. Any website that generates a hex code for you is also going to generate the red, green, blue mixture of a color. And the reason why this is more useful and powerful than a hex code is that it will support an alpha channel. Alpha channels give you the ability to control the opacity of a color. So, for example, if you have a red, green, and blue mixture and you give it an alpha channel of 0.5, that means 50% opacity, since alpha channels understand 0.0 to 1.0, with that being transparent and 1 being opaque. It also does register hundreds numbers, so something like 0.55 would be registered by the system, if not specifically by your eyes. The reason this is more useful than at the opacity property is if you were to use the opacity property and make it 50%, that would make everything in the element 50%, including the text. And that is not ideal, because that might make your text very difficult to read, especially if the background is somewhat busy. The alpha channel will just make the color of the background, for example, semi-transparent while leaving the text opaque. Now, once again, that was fine for a while, but people still have still been innovating, and there is a new ability to use colors on the block called HSL colors, which stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. This has opened up a whole new world of grayscales and sepia tones and washout colors, and this also supports an alpha channel, so therefore some kind of transparency. Now, this has made designers' lives wonderful because they can get the variations and the slight tones and etc. that they would like. But the problem is that these are quite new and are not supported by every version of every browser. So what you have to do is to pass-proof your CSS when you use these fancy new ways to put in colors. What that means is you have to make sure that the solid color is also within your styling, so that if a browser does not understand HSL or RGB for whatever reason, it will insert the solid color. You have to put the solid color in above everything else. So for example, you would put in color white and then your semicolon, and then below it color RGB and the mixture for white and whatever alpha channel you would like. It has to be above because the DOM executes from the top left corner to the bottom right corner in lines. So if you put the fancy way to do colors above the solid color, it will only ever read the solid color. Whereas if you put this fanciness below the solid color, it will read the solid color, and those browsers that understand RGB and HSL will overwrite with that rule, with that declaration. So keep that in mind when you are creating your codes. And remember to please pass-proof your CSS so that your designs come out almost like how you want them to, if not exactly. After colors, the most important thing that people worry about in their designs is their fonts. Fonts make an impact on your readers and your viewers because they are what give the site its very specific look. If you've ever used a formatted word processor, you've probably used a feature that allows you to change the font. The actual technical term for a font is a typeface, and in your styling and CSS, it is actually referred to as a font family. To change the typeface of your web page, you can use the font family property. Now, the problem with this is not every font that you want to use is installed on every computer. So you have to make sure that the web pages have access to the font so that it can display it. And the way you do that is by creating browser fallbacks. Now, there are two basic differences between fonts. There are more in terms of design, but for the purposes of displaying them as CSS, there are two. There are serif fonts and sans serif fonts. A quick history lesson: serif fonts were created for print media like books and newspapers, and a serif, if you didn't know, are these little decorative bits that are extra. It makes things easier to read, and it was a side effect of the original ways to print things. Back when the internet was invented and screen resolution was very low, though, to create a font on a screen and deliberately add in these little serifs made no sense. Because when you only have 800 pixels to work with, to add in 2 extra decorative pixels made no sense. So sans serif fonts were created for screens. It used to be the only way that you could get a legible font to display, but since then, screens have evolved to like 10 times that amount of resolution. So this screen, for example, is 1600. So it is almost double, if not more. And so 2 extra little pixels of serif fonts doesn't really make a difference anymore. Now it is more of a design concern. So if you want more of an antique look, you would probably use a serif font. If you want a more modern look, you'd probably go with a sans serif font. There are also issues of readability, but those are all design concerns, which you must, as a designer, decide for yourself. What I need to show you is how to make sure that if you choose to use a fancy font, say a fancy serif font, how to make it display. Despite the fact that not every computer has all the same fonts installed, there are about 6 that you can just about guarantee every computer has access to, and they are Arial, Times New Roman, Helvetica, Georgia, Impact, and Comic Sans. The most common 2 used are Times New Roman and Arial, respectively, for serif and sans serif fonts. So the way you create your fallbacks while still using your fancy fonts is when you put in your font family property, your first part of your value is my old-time fancy font, or whatever your new fancy font is called, comma, whatever the fallback font is, in this case Times New Roman, since this is a serif font. And then what you're telling your computer afterwards is, should for any reason it be unable to find Times New Roman installed to display, it should then display whichever serif fonts are available. So if, for example, someone has decided to uninstall Times New Roman as a font on their computer, it will instead put in probably Georgia. This creates a bunch of fallbacks for the fonts, just in case your fancy one doesn't read, and it guarantees that your design will look something like what you want, if not exactly. Now, because there are so many fonts and new fonts are being developed every single day, you need to be able to make sure that your fonts can be displayed. And it's very unpredictable about which fonts a web page can display, but there are 2 ways that you can just about guarantee that the web page will display them. The first one is using Google Fonts. If you have never visited Google Fonts, please do go. It is very simple and easy to use and very stable for you to use. Basically, how they work is the same way as if you were linking in a style page. Google Fonts has style sheets with font information loaded onto their servers and provides you access to them. There are 2 ways to use a Google font, either as a linked document or using the @import property. The @import property will also work, but is not guaranteed to work on older browsers, whereas using the link element will. The link element will work on 95.99% of browsers. So if you haven't taken a look at Google Fonts, please go have a look. It is very fun to use and very interesting. However, Google Fonts supports at the moment just over 800 fonts. In the grand scheme of how many fonts exist in the world, that is a drop in the ocean. And you may discover that although you've looked at all 800 fonts on Google Fonts, none of them are the one you want for your design, but you found one and downloaded it to your computer that you do want. Provided that you are permitted to use these by the copyright of whatever font, you can in fact create a font kit, which is creating the CSS file that Google is hosting, for example. and you use the add font face rule. How you create a font kit is more advanced than I wanted to demonstrate here, but if you click the link attached to this document, it does link you to our back to RPG directory, and it will take you to a tutorial on how to add font kits to your web skins and your pages and all of your templates, etc. Comes with pictures and full instructions and even some troubleshooting if there are problems. So please use that if you would like to know how to add font kits to any of your creations. Now, we've been talking about very general elements this entire time. Things like paragraphs and headings. If you change the styling for them, you're going to change the styling for every single heading and paragraph on your site, which is both useful and not useful. If you want to change it for everything, that's very handy, but sometimes you want to change just the styling for a particular area. What this means is you have to be able to target a specific element, and the way you do that is by naming them. And there are two ways that you can name them. You can either use identifiers or you can use classes. Identifiers are unique in that there should only ever be one of them on a page. So it's useful for things like banner, sidebar, etc., where you will only have one in a skin. Classes allow you to provide multiple elements with the same styling. So for example, if you had a sidebar identifier, you could have 3 classes inside called sidebar content box. And the styling would be applied identically to all 3 of those boxes within. This is very useful if you want to have multiples of the same thing, whereas using identifiers and giving each one a unique name means that you have a rule for each one, at least one rule, which makes your markup very bloated very quickly. And the more bloated your markup is, the longer it takes to load. So learn to love the classes and stop using identifiers if you code only in them. I've seen a couple of new coders who code exclusively in identifiers. Please don't do that anymore. Now, to make sure that your styling and your markup can read one another, identifiers are selected in the style sheet using the hashtag or octothird character, which is its real name. Whereas classes are designated by the period or full stop or dot, whatever you call that. Now, when naming either of your identifiers or your classes, there's a consideration that you should have, which is everything that has the same name is going to have the same styling applied. Meaning, if you give your class or identifier something as general a name as box, there are loads of places on a page where a box could show up. So that is a bit too general as a name and is very likely to cause a clash within other coding. However, if you decide to name it something like top sidebar box for welcome things, that is a bit too specific, because then you're going to have to create a rule for everything instead of just for all of the sidebar boxes that are the same. You will have 3 rules for your 3 different boxes. So you have to strike a balance about something like sidebar content box. The other thing you should be aware of is to make sure that your names are general enough to be able to be understood by everyone who uses your codes, and also specific enough that it will not cause a clash should multiple coders' codes be used. People who create sites and use pre-mades very rarely will use all of the codes from the same person. They will use one person's skin, one person's rules template, one person's mini profile, etc. And you have to make sure that your codes do not clash with any of those. How you solve this problem, a lot of people will choose a name for that particular code, and they will prefix the name to everything else. If you would like to, go have a look at my codes and you'll see an example of how that works. Other people, to shorten this, because it is a lot to type, will remove all of the vowels, because it is still legible if you remove the vowels. It just makes it less to type. So it's up to you how you fix this. Another thing you can do is add a class to your general elements. So for example, if you have a class element, say this element was all of the boxes in your sidebar, but you would like the paragraphs of those elements to have a line height of 12 pixels, then you can specify a class for a general element and style accordingly. As mentioned before, you can also select multiple classes or IDs for a styling rule. You just put the selectors down with comments between them, and it all works exactly as I did in this example. Finally, you can also do the reverse, which is apply multiple classes to the same element. So say this element was your sidebar box. You wanted one of the classes, you wanted one thing to have all of the color information and class 2 to have all of the font information. If you put down the name for class 1 with a space and then class 2 attached to the element, it will apply the styling for both to that element. This is very handy for having minimal rules and maximum output. So just keep that in mind as you progress through the course and start creating your own codes. Now, for this entire course, you're going to need to be using text editors in order to create your codes. A text editor is basically anything that will read and output code. Online, the 3 most common ones used are Scratchpad, CodePen, and JS Fiddle. They all do basically the same things, but people have their favorites and their favorite flavors. And in general, which one you use for the course is irrelevant, except for projects 1, 2, and 3. For those 3 projects, you have to use Scratchpad. And the reason for this is I would like you to put in the boilerplate and modify that boilerplate. The editors CodePen and JS Fiddle come preloaded with this. So it's going to put out these errors telling you to please remove these tags and please remove the head tags, etc., because they're already quote unquote in the background. And it's assuming all you actually want to code in is here in the body tags. So do not use JS Fiddle or CodePen because you're going to get errors for projects 1, 2, and 3. Just use Scratchpad because then if you paste it in and use it here, it should all be fine. You can also get offline code editors, including things like Atom, Sublime, and Node++. There are dozens more out there. Some are paid for and some are free. Some have free sections, etc. If you want to code offline, they're very useful. They operate just like an online a text editor and give you some output, and you will just have to research and pick your favorite. There are 3 mini classes available for this week. The first one has already gone up, which is a recap and reinforcement of the boilerplate and the creation of a basic web page. Class 2 is a recap and reinforcement of how CSS rules and declarations work, which means you will style the web page that you just built. And then I will be introducing the CSS box model and a recap of identifier elements, and also introducing nesting of elements if you've never done that before, which means put a box inside a box. This is all going to go up as notes that you can read and will not be taught. So please keep up with your reading and your projects. There is also a bonus project available for creating a basic posting template available for you on Friday. That's when that will go up. One thing I should note is when you are creating these things, you need to create yourself a portfolio if you're going to join us for Camp Codo, so that you can link in all of the projects that you build. One thing I would like to make very clear is please do not paste in your codes into RPG directory, because our pages do in fact execute HTML. So just put down a link. If you attempt to paste your code in, it's going to try and read it, and you stand a good chance of breaking a page if you don't know what you're doing. So please just don't do it. In your portfolios, just put down the link to your creations, and we will find them as we go along. That is all for this week's big class. I hope you join us, and I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you very much.